Welcome to the Top 12 Highlights with Mr. Rodman. This is Chapter 2, and we are covering the Constitution and the constitutional foundations. Let's kick it off by looking at the Constitution. Article 1 addresses the legislative branch. These are the individuals that make the laws. Article 2 is the executive branch. They enforce the laws. And Article 3 is the judicial branch. They're going to interpret the laws. Article 4 looks at the idea of federalism, this sharing of power between national and state governments, and also what happens in terms of how we deal with relationships between the states. Article 5 looks at how are we going to amend this Constitution, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Article 6 addresses this idea of supremacy. If national and state government conflicts, who wins? And the answer is the national government. How often? Every time. And we'll address more of the supremacy clause later on. Article 7 finally talks about ratification of this Constitution and the fact that 9 of the 13 colonies need to sign on to that ratification in order for it to take effect. Not unanimity, 13 of 13, like you did with the Articles of Confederation. And then we address the Bill of Rights, obviously the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, known as the Bill of Rights. So amending the Constitution, it's only been done 27 times. The first 10 amendments come from the Bill of Rights and the idea that we need protections in there for citizens from the national government, just to be sure that the George Masons and the Patrick Henrys of the world are pleased. And it was a deal James Madison cut with the Anti-Federalists so that they wouldn't call for another constitutional convention and open up the floodgates of editing the Constitution once again. So we've only done this really after the Bill of Rights. We've only done this about 17 times since that time period. And we've covered lots of things, everything from voting and protections to taxes to disability and succession of the president in times of the Cold War. But to have this around for 231 years and only having done that at 18 different intervals is pretty impressive for a constitution to have lasted that long. Now, federalism is this idea of sharing of power. It's the handshake between national and state governments. They're sharing that power to limit the power of government. Separation of powers comes from Montesquieu, this idea of the sharing of power. So they have separate but distinct roles and responsibilities, different powers among them. The legislative branch making the laws. They're not going to enforce it. They may have a check on them later on about how they enforce it, but that's going to be the job of the executive branch. The executive branch is going to enforce those laws, and they're going to rely on the legislative branch to make the laws in such a way that then they can interpret and implement them. And then the judicial branch is going to interpret those laws to determine if they're constitutional. And whether they withstand any unconstitutional scrutiny. So that wasn't enough in terms of the checks on the different branches in terms of their roles and responsibilities. And it is different here because the roles of the branches are the powers. Those separation of powers are the roles and responsibilities. The checks and balances is how do they keep each other in check? How do they balance out the power between them? And this is how they do that. The first one we'll take a look at the very top there is the legislative branch checking the executive branch. They can approve presidential nominations. They have the power of the purse or the ability to control the budget. They can also pass laws that over the president's veto, and they can override that veto. They can also impeach a president or a vice president and remove them from office if so need be. And that's the power the legislative branch has to keep the executive branch in check. Now, what can the president do? What can the executive branch do to keep the legislative branch in check? The power of veto. They can veto a bill. And as we know, the idea here is that it takes a lot to override a veto, but that is the power that the president has to do so. And I mentioned in class the idea of during the George W. Bush administration, there was 1 or 2 overrides, and the same thing with the Obama administration. So to have legislation vetoed and only 1 out of 8 years overridden is a pretty big deal. Now, what can the legislative branch do to check the judicial branch? Well, they're going to approve nominations. The Senate has the role of advice and consent, and they will approve or deny the nominations. The Brett Kavanaugh hearings that we've been looking at lately are one example of the Judiciary Committee in the Senate looking at that role of advice and consent. The judicial branch then can declare laws unconstitutional. That's how they keep the legislative branch in check and balance out the power between them. The judicial branch can also declare a president's acts or orders unconstitutional. A presidential act or a presidential order has the full force of law. It's like a law that was passed by the Congress and signed by the president. The only difference here is it's actually just a presidential order by the president. And a good example was President Trump's travel ban. The courts ruled that unconstitutional. He went back and drafted another, and that was ruled unconstitutional. Now we're on our third round, and so far that has most of it has withstood the scrutiny of the constitutionality aspect. But what can the executive branch do then to check the judicial branch? Well, the president nominates judges. And that nomination role is really critical because they serve for life on these federal benches. Whether that's the federal bench across the 84 jurisdictions across the country under the Judiciary Act, or whether it's the circuit courts, the semifinals of the Supreme Court, and then the Supreme Court itself. So that is one way that the president has sweeping powers to impact and check and balance the roles of the judicial branch. Now, it's a lot easier to pass laws and get things done when you have unified government. Unified government is the idea that, like we have right now, that Congress is of one party, the Republicans, dominate both houses, the Senate and the House, and then the Republicans, because President Trump is a Republican, they also dominate and rule the executive branch. So they are unified right now. Now, when President Obama was in office, the Congress was the Congress was Republican in majority, and the President Obama was a Democrat, so it was divided government at that time, which leads to a lot of gridlock. Now, despite what we may say about gridlock, we being the average Joe, John Q. Public, and the average person in America today, people tend to vote for gridlock. They like it when you can slow things down and keep things from happening. That means you can't create more laws. That means you can't raise our taxes. That means you can't put in a bunch of programs that we may not like. So people tend to vote for that type of thing. Even though we may say we don't like gridlock, many people tend to vote in that general direction. So to be continued, we'll see in November how that plays out. But the question is, with that partisanship, separation of powers is even more of a limit, and that was really by design. That was the Madisonian model, to keep the whims of the masses, the tyranny of the majority from taking over and basically coming in, with like a bull in a china shop, and basically obliterating the laws and regulations that are on the books and the implementation of those laws. So then we get to the judicial branch in number 7, judicial review. This idea that the judicial branch has the power to interpret the Constitution. Now, please keep in mind, the judicial branch does not look, I repeat, does not look at every law. They only look at the ones that they have determined may be unconstitutional. And even that, they may come to find out on further scrutiny that it actually is constitutional. But the idea here is the Supreme Court has a rule called the Rule of 4, and it means that 4 of the 9 justices sitting on the court have to agree to hear a case. Otherwise, they won't hear a case. So it's at least 4 justices on the court that agree, even though they may be overruled by a majority, 5 that actually think that it's constitutional. If there are 4 that want to hear the case, then they will talk further about granting what we call writ of certiorari, or granting cert, and calling up for the papers of the lower court's case or appeal to hear the case. And granted, they get about 10,000 appeals for a writ of certiorari each term. That's the October to June, and they only grant a couple hundred at most. And lately they've been under the 200 mark at the 170, 180 a year type of format. So what are they doing here? They're determining the constitutionality of the circumstances based on the case that they are seeing. So some cases may not have standing to sue. They may not they may not be unduly harmed. Some cases it may not be a constitutional issue for them to address, and they see no issue, and then they wouldn't probably take the case. Is there a constitutional power for the Supreme Court to review the constitutionality of the laws that are passed? And the answer is not explicitly in the Constitution, but as we know, John Marshall and the Marshall Court really exacerbated this role as part of judicial review, as part of their role in kind of hamming up the judicial branch. And as a result of this, we see that Federalists especially really saw a role that the courts could play here and favored that type of judicial review. And thus, that's where we start to see a role in the constitutionality of laws, presidential orders, and acts, and that sort of thing. So Marbury versus Madison, a critical case here because of the idea of judicial review is really established here. The terms about declaring the constitutionality of this. Now, we accept today that the court's going to step in, but back then at that time, it was pretty monumental that the Supreme Court was going to declare some type of law or act or order unconstitutional, and that's pretty significant here in those terms. Background on Marbury versus Madison: midnight judges appointed at the 11th hour as John Adams was leaving the White House. They had been sealed in envelopes but hadn't been delivered. That was Madison's job, and as a result of the new president coming in, Jefferson said, "Don't deliver those." Don't deliver those appointments. And so at the behest of the new president coming in, he didn't. Marbury, who was going to be receiving one of those appointments, sued, and thus we have the landmark case that we see here today. The moral of the story is Jefferson won the battle but lost the war, essentially. He did not want to see the judicial branch stepping in and declaring whether presidential acts or orders were unconstitutional because he was coming in as the president, and the last thing he wanted was the judicial review in his business. He also didn't see the role that they played in declaring laws from Congress unconstitutional. But as a result of this, they did side with Jefferson in saying he didn't have to deliver those appointments. It was constitutional for him to order Madison not to deliver those appointments, and as a result, ever since, we have had the Supreme Court weighing in on this concept of judicial review. Litigation, this concept that you see here is where people are taking action in the court in order to bring some type of public policy change. We saw this with Brown versus Board of Education, in which they tried lobbying, they tried appealing to members of Congress. They tried to get legislation passed, and finally Thurgood Marshall said we had to take it to the courts. So that really is the derivation of where this comes from in looking at judicial review. Now, some informal methods in terms of how you can change the meaning of the Constitution was really left to Congress to kind of fill in these gaps. And because they knew that they weren't going to be able to solve all ills, they knew that if this Constitution was going to be able to stand the test of time, they were going to have to figure out ways that Congress could step in and could modify and amend and change this. And so they really left that in the hands of Congress, in the hands of the individuals that would be elected leaders, either by state legislatures in the Senate or by elected of the people in the House of Representatives, and left that work for them. The Judiciary Act of 1789 is a great example of this. They basically set up the court system that beneath the Supreme Court is what we still use today. It's the basic structure there. But elaboration is kind of what the founders and framers looked at in terms of letting Congress kind of fill in those gaps and really kind of take the the meaning of the Constitution and take it to the next step. One of these, in terms of the role here, would be impeachment. High crimes and misdemeanors is pretty vague, and so the idea was let Congress figure it out. Let the House of Representatives impeach a president or a vice president or a cabinet member or a sitting judge, and let them figure out what is deemed as impeachable. What is deemed to be impeachable, and then let the Senate decide how they're going to deal with the trial. Yes, the Supreme Court's Chief Justice will serve as the kind of the arbiter or the facilitator of the case, but the idea is that it's the Senate, 100 members of the Senate, that are the jurors in that particular case, and so this is that elaboration that we see there. Now, presidential acts and orders, I kind of mentioned it earlier because the idea is that the check on this is that the judicial branch can declare these acts or orders unconstitutional, but they do carry the full force of law. It's just like a law that was passed by Congress, signed by the president, and they do tend to set some precedent, presidents setting precedents. But the idea here is that they can be challenged. It does have the full force of law. The travel ban, for instance, Trump's travel ban was very controversial, and so it does give presidents pause in terms of using those types of powers and making sure that they've been vetted properly with White House counsel, with lawyers that work for the president. Executive privilege, very similar to that. If the president doesn't want someone to testify or doesn't want to share information, they claim executive privilege. The impoundment of funds has kind of changed over time in terms of Congress basically passing a law, the Impoundment and Control Act. If the president's not going to use the money, then you got to send it back to Congress and give them warning. They have 60 days to change their mind, or else you can use the money however you wish. Usually Congress figures out a way to put the money somewhere. And the power to send troops. A lot of these aren't specifically mentioned in the Constitution, but the president is commander-in-chief. Therefore, as commander-in-chief, the mindset is, and kind of the assumption in an inherent power here, is that the president has the power to send troops. Also using the media as the bully pulpit. President Trump uses Twitter, and basically everybody takes note and pays attention. That's a significant role that has changed over time. The presidents have always used the press in some way, shape, or form to help kind of set the agenda and set the policy agenda in terms of what they want to work on, set the media agenda in terms of what people are talking about. But the idea there is that just by setting the policy agenda of the day, the president really can shape the message, and that obviously is not something that's outlined in the Constitution, but is something that we have seen over and over again, and we definitely are living in the current time. We're seeing where the president really does send and set the message just by simple tweets that are sent out in relation to what are the news media talking about today, what are members of Congress talking about, what are members of the cabinet talking about. They're talking about the president's tweets. The morning talk shows, for instance, are all talking about the president, who's setting the agenda via Twitter. And it has definitely been a mouthpiece for him that he's been successful with, and so he continues to use it as such. Let's get on to number 10, judicial review in this judicial interpretation. We have seen where the court has gone one way and then changed its mind. We saw this with Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. It would take them 58 years, but in Brown versus Board of Education, they would basically reverse themselves to a unanimous decision in Brown saying that separate but equal was unconstitutional. And then they've also kind of used a case to set a precedent, build a foundation for other cases. Griswold v. Connecticut was a privacy case. Can people talk with families about contraceptive options and family planning options? And in Griswold, they said yes, there was a right to privacy there, a penumbra of privacy, basically cobbling together the first, second, third, and ninth, and a couple of amendments in relation to, First, Second, Third, Fourth, and Ninth Amendments, basically cobbling together this right to privacy that isn't outlined in the Constitution, but has been interpreted through a more loose interpretation, has been interpreted as a right to privacy. And that right to privacy was then used as a precedent, a basically foundation setting in Roe v. Wade, the famous abortion case. To really use that right to privacy then to say, well, if you have a right to privacy, you have a right to an abortion, women's right to choose, the famous 1973 case. So this is how judicial review has gone to more judicial interpretation, and looking at these two options, we see there's two types. I mentioned the loose form, the adaptive, the ones I was just talking about here with Griswold v. Connecticut and with Roe v. Wade are very adaptive in nature. They're very loose construction. This is interpretations that the courts have made that is very, what would the Constitution mean in our time, versus an originalist or a strict construction approach that is much more on the fixed meaning. What did the Constitution and its words mean at the time of 1787? And really looking at that as such. Now, where do we put the judges today on this spectrum? We would see Clarence Thomas and Sam Alito and the more conservative judges would be in the originalist category, much more strict construction in nature. We would see that a Ruth Bader Ginsburg or a Sonia Sotomayor would be more of an adaptive or a loose construction in nature. Elena Kagan, for instance, would fall into that category. Neil Gorsuch, the latest on the court, would be more of an originalist. And the assumption is that Brett Kavanaugh is very similar to that originalist because his ideology tends to match President Trump's and the Republican ideology in terms of that originalist in nature. So let's move on to amending the Constitution then. If we see that something needs to change and the Supreme Court won't change it, what can we do? We can amend the Constitution. Now look at these two columns. The first column essentially is what I call the 2/3 column. The second column is the 3/4 column. This is from a different book, not from the book you're currently using, but it is a really great chart that kind of breaks this down in terms of two things that need to happen. You need to pick one category from column 1, phase 1, and you need to pick one of the items from phase 2, from column 2. So Congress can propose an amendment by a 2/3 vote, and state legislatures can ratify it by a 3/4 vote. So pick one from the 2/3 column, pick one from the 3/4 column, and that is how we can amend the Constitution. And that has actually been the way we have amended everything except the 21st Amendment. That was the only one that was done in another method, and that was through state conventions. But most of them have been through Congress, 2/3 in each house approving it, and then sending it on to state legislatures, and 3/4 of those have ratified it or approved it. And this is a role where Congress proposes the amendment and votes on it. It's really the state legislatures then that approve it, which is kind of different than what we see for most things that happen because this is federalism at work. If you're going to change the Constitution, which we have done, Bill of Rights 10 times and 17 others, total of 27 times we've done this, it's been through Congress and state legislatures that have made it happen. But there are a couple of other options. We can call for a national convention. Obviously, Madison didn't want to do that. And propose an amendment. Again, 2/3 of the states would have to agree to that. And then 3/4 of the states would have to ratify it. Or 3/4 of state ratifying conventions would have to ratify that amendment. And those are possible, but we've not used those types. The other option for the 21st Amendment was Congress approves the amendment by 2/3 vote in each of the House and the Senate, and then sends it on to state conventions, and that was to repeal prohibition, where that took place. So that is how we amend the Constitution, and remember, 2/3, 3/4, that will serve you well. States can't unratify an amendment once they've ratified it. Once they've approved it, that's it. Unless Congress specifies a time limit, and they have on some of these, usually 7 to 10 years, unless they put a time limit on it, there is no time limit on ratification. Article 5 of the Constitution does not put a time limit on it. So the 27th Amendment was actually one that was approved by James Madison. It was proposed by James Madison, and he couldn't get Congress and the states to agree on it. So it would leave it to a University of Texas student to do that 200 years later. And that was for congressional pay. If you want a pay raise in Congress, you've got to wait and sit for another election. And then once you're reelected, then you can get your pay raise. And that was basically the 27th Amendment. So, expanding the electorate, how do we get to more direct democracy? We have a lot of ways that we have direct democracy today, where people are participating more than ever in our democracy. And that's not just in elections and voting, that's also in ways that they make their voices heard, ways that they run for office, and they join interest groups, and they become members of political parties, and they work at the polls on election day, and they work on campaigns. But we've done a lot to move towards a much larger electorate. And we see this from the 15th Amendment, where African American men have the right to vote. The 17th Amendment, where now you can elect your state senators. The 19th Amendment, where women now have the right to vote. And the 23rd, where D.C. gets the right to vote in a presidential election. All of these are expanding the electorate to a larger voting public than ever. But we can't make them vote. It's not compulsory. It's not a requirement. And that's why we're reliant on people to do the right thing and do the right thing and vote in order to make their voices heard. And that's why I teach this class, and that's why I hope one of the things you will get out of here more than ever is that you will see that the importance of voting and the importance of making your voice heard, because you can and will make a difference in this world and in whatever you choose to do. And I hope you will make it awesome, as I know you will. Have a great day. Hope this helped with Chapter 2. Go back if you need to and live the 5.